So for those of you still joining, we are preparing by getting something that we like the taste of. We don't need much. It can just be a little piece of fruit, chocolate, a nut. If you can't eat, then even water would do, actually. So it can be something liquid, anything that you can take in your mouth and that isn't an unpleasant taste. Let's put it like this, if you can't go for something delicious. Good. So I'm hoping you can still hear me even if you are out getting props. We're going to speak tonight about pleasure as one of the main driving forces of our existence. Now, somehow we are making a lot of efforts in order to experience pleasure. If we look at our life, very often a lot of the efforts that we're making in various ways are meant to bring us more pleasure. It's different things that we consider brings us pleasure, but nevertheless we make a lot of efforts to have delicious food, in this way to experience pleasure, to do things that we enjoy, to have adventures, to make love, have sensual experiences, one of maybe the greatest sources of pleasure. Even things like going to the spa, having a massage, other things like those that give us a certain sensuous pleasure is something that we place a big importance on often in life. And we will tend to make a lot of efforts to make that possible. So even the efforts that we're making, which are not necessarily giving us so much pleasure, would often be to make it possible to have pleasure in another moment. So for many people, somehow there in the background, pleasure is the driving force and the motivating force for many of their life choices and activities in daily life. Now, that is because pleasure is for many, considered one of the main ingredients to happiness. So one of the main ways that we are bringing happiness into our life. And we are all searching for happiness. Somehow, if we are to find something we can agree on, regardless of the life choices we have made, regardless of what we like to do, it is that we are searching for happiness, that we want to be happy. And that most of the things we do because we believe it will bring us happiness, either right now, an immediate gratification, or long term will bring some results or some consequences that we feel would bring us a greater happiness. So we seek for happiness in many different ways. And one of the main ways that we seek for happiness is through the experience of pleasure, if we look at most people's lives. And therefore it plays a paramount role somehow in this universal search for happiness that we can say human beings are having. So we seek pleasure because we believe it will make us happy and that it will make us feel fulfilled, because that's maybe one of the ways we are interpreting happiness. The feeling of fulfillment, somehow feeling content, complete, and wanting for nothing. That would be the complete fulfillment, and we intuit that that would also bring us a certain measure of happiness. Now, unfortunately, very often this fulfillment that we're longing for, and therefore also the profound happiness that comes along with that, seems to stay outside of our reach. Even if we dedicate very big parts of our life to the pursuit of pleasure, we might still be without that satisfaction, that complete fulfillment, and that deep sense of happiness that we are searching. And in a consumerist society, somehow what is a characteristic of pretty much everybody is that we continuously want more. It's never ever enough. Like we sing, I can get no satisfaction. Somehow it's never enough, even if we do it a lot. And that's the case very much for pleasure as well. Therefore, we could see us even become a little bit addicted to pleasure because we try all the time to get more and more and more, searching for that fulfillment, searching for the happiness of a completely fulfilled, pleasurable experience. Yet somehow, always, there is this nagging feeling that something is missing. And then we try one more, because maybe just a little bit more, and we can finally feel satisfied and feel content and happy. Now, maybe you have noticed if you overindulge somehow in the experiences of pleasure, or in this hunt for pleasure, which is one maybe of two tendencies that we can see in a consumerist society, is overindulging in pleasurable experiences. Could actually be the case you would have noticed in this last period of time with the lockdown. Suddenly having more time on your hands, you might have had more time to do the things you find pleasurable. If you have been in a good situation, you have been paid, and you wouldn't have to do as much as you normally would for those money, which would enable you to do things that you consider pleasurable, like staying in the sun, or reading a good book, or eating something nice, or in other ways indulging in pleasurable experiences. But somehow this constant experience of the thing we find pleasurable is not actually making us happy. If we all the time, for instance, sit in the sun and read a book, it won't bring us happiness. Now, maybe you never had the experience of kind of doing it for long enough that you get bored and you would like to do something, you would like to get out, you would like to accomplish things. Perhaps you had time in the last 3 months, but otherwise often we don't actually get to that realization. But overindulging in something we find pleasurable doesn't actually give us satisfaction. This has to do with the way that we are experiencing pleasure, as we will also discover. When we are not so conscious in our experiences of pleasure, we don't really reach fulfillment no matter how long we do it. And we even end up getting out of a state of balance. Because what we would discover is that where we feel somehow a profound state of fulfillment and contentment and happiness is in fact when we have a state of balance. Balance between doing somehow or making efforts and seeking pleasure, having pleasurable experiences. When those two are in the right proportions, we can say, in our life, then we will feel content and happy. So the happiness is in fact found in this state of balance. We could say it's balance between work and leisure, balance between activity and relaxation, balance between being together, being apart in a couple relationship, for instance, and so on. Always somehow is in the point of balance that we find the fulfillment, that we find the happiness. But often when it comes to pleasure, we don't have a balance, because either we kind of try to overindulge because it seems it's never enough and we're never really satisfied, or we deprive ourselves of pleasure because we consider that pleasure is not something that is valid to spend your time on. For various reasons, maybe you don't consider you deserve those pleasurable experiences and so on. So we tend to have maybe a daily life that is much more towards pushing and kind of depriving yourself of moments of relaxation and enjoyment, which also creates a state of unbalance and unhappiness. And then, of course, in that situation, pleasure seems as the answer. If only I could have pleasure all the time, meaning doing the things I like all the time, then I would be happy, then I would be content. Now, in the case you suddenly have the possibility to do so, you might discover it's not the case. You can equally well be miserable even if you do what you like all the time. So there is a secret somewhere there in the balance, which I will also return to a bit towards the end of tonight's webinar. But I'd like to continue, or to begin rather actually, this look at pleasure from a more tantric perspective. Starting with a very fundamental tantric attitude is also where you will need your little fruit or chocolate or whatever you have soon. So just make sure you have it nearby, or bring your phone with you as you go and get it now if you still didn't get something that you like. I see a few holding up things, so at least we have some who are prepared. But the idea that we meet here, first in the approach towards pleasure, where we start having a different way of relating to pleasure and understanding pleasure, is about how we are experiencing it, how aware we actually are in the experience of a pleasurable activity of whatever kind that might be. So one of the very first lessons that Tantra teaches us, which for instance in our Tantra course also is placed in the very beginning of the lessons, even before we start the journey through the chakras, we have this idea of awareness and relaxation. It's a fundamental tantric attitude where we train the ability to be really relaxed and also to be very attentive, very present at the same time. In reality, when it comes to having a completely fulfilling, pleasurable experience, that kind of pleasure that somehow I think we all intuit exists, because I hear many times in different contexts, often it comes up regarding our erotic life and our sensual experiences in intimacy, that we somehow feel there could be something more, that something is missing, and that it could be completely amazing, but it's only really good somehow. There is a difference, let's say, between what we are having and what we feel it could be. It's kind of how it is with life, generally speaking. We also often feel, even if life is good, somehow we have this feeling life could be extraordinary. And that is, in fact, what Tantra offers us. And this attitude of awareness and relaxation is at the very foundation of such a possibility. Now, very often when we say that we pay attention to something, this idea of paying attention, we consider it means being a little bit tense. And we have to push somehow. So often when we are paying attention, we're a bit tense. That makes it very difficult to enjoy and experience pleasure. Because if you notice the characteristic somehow of having a pleasurable experience is that you relax and open up. That's also why we want them so much, because it makes us relax and feel good and somehow open ourselves. And then those two things seem to contradict. To be aware and also to be really relaxed and have a pleasurable experience. Which is why very often when we have a pleasurable experience, we're not actually very attentive to it. Which is one of the main reasons why it's never enough, because you're not really there. And if you're not really there, it's not also completely satisfying. It doesn't completely touch you. It doesn't completely somehow fill you, we can say, that experience. Therefore, this training in the ability to be both fully present with what is going on and at the same time able to relax and enjoy is one of the secret keys to be able to have these very profoundly fulfilling, pleasurable experiences. Otherwise, when we are somehow not so attentive to the experience of pleasure, which we actually see a lot in our society, it turns into addictions even that sometimes have very damaging effects for us. When people are addicted to eating, for instance, because they find pleasure in the food, you end up obese. Or if you get addicted to the pleasure you feel in taking drugs, for instance, you can become addicted to that, or to alcohol, to other stimulants in this way. Because somehow you don't pay attention to the whole experience. So in the cases of taking substances that are actually harmful for you, you take them because you like it, but you don't really pay attention to the whole range of effects. How you also feel when you come down, what it does to your physical body, a lot of nuances around what that actually does to you. And therefore you somehow blindly end up overindulging and not actually ending up happier. Usually on the contrary, when we are in an addiction or deep in an addiction, things are just getting worse and worse and worse. Again, the state of balance lack. And we can be in that addiction because we are not fully aware of what is going on when we indulge in that apparently very pleasurable experience that we have in that moment. When we bring awareness, and that's usually then what we do, we bring awareness and say, no, this is bad, I shouldn't do it. And then we refrain from having pleasure instead, being a little bit afraid of getting addicted or pulled into it in various ways. Instead, we just stay away from that experience. Now, combining the two, both being aware and open and relaxed to have pleasurable experiences, that's when we can find ecstasy, or when we can somehow find that perfect, fulfilling experience. Now, because of this idea, somehow we can say the difference between a good experience of pleasure or a bad experience of pleasure is the amount of consciousness or awareness that we manifest in that. We're going to do a little exercise now with what you have to eat or drink. And if you cannot eat, then you can even use some water, because the main idea now is to bring awareness to a sensorial impression. In this case, we will use the taste, because it's often one where we can feel a lot of pleasure through what we are tasting, if we like it, of course. If it's not possible at all for you to put anything in your mouth, you could even have a sensation of touch. Touch something that's really soft and you like the sensation of how it feels on your fingers or something like this. But you want to have access now to a sensorial experience or impression that you will like, that at least you find pleasant to some extent, and you can pay attention to. So whatever you have available now, I'm going to guide it with regards to eating something, but replace the idea if you are touching or in other ways finding an experience that is pleasant. Now, for those of you who have something to eat, I would like you just to take whatever it is you have and try first to look at it a little and anticipate how you're going to feel when you're eating it. And I want you just to try for the next few moments to be fully present with this experience and this thing that you're about to put in your mouth. We're just going to start with a moment of anticipating a little bit. So anticipate now what it's going to feel like when you put it in your mouth. It might be very different, but still, you can probably feel some feelings now coming up or some sensations. Maybe even you're salivating a little if it's something you like very much and you anticipate eating it. And you can even bring it to your nose and just try to smell it a bit. Feel the smell and how your body reacts to the smell of that. You can even close your eyes as you smell it and just try to feel what happens. If there are any sensations in your body, if you feel anything in particular, just whatever comes up. And now bring it to your lips. You can even gently touch it to your lips, just feeling the sensations as whatever it is you're holding is touching your lips. Even if it's liquid, you can feel the coolness or the softness of it on your lips, still without putting it in your mouth. And now, very slowly, put whatever it is you're having in your mouth. Just place it in your mouth, still without chewing it. And spend a moment to become aware of its texture, just how it feels when you're placing it in your mouth. If it's liquid, just feel the sensation of having that cool, warmth, softness, whatever it is in your mouth. And now slowly start to bite into whatever it is you are having, feeling the sensations of biting into it, or what happens if it changes texture as you are chewing. Noticing also the taste. And becoming aware of all the sensations in your body as a reaction to what is happening in your mouth right now. If it's liquid, you can simply move it around in your mouth a bit and feel the sensations of having it there. Just noticing all responses. And now, if you are ready to do so, gently swallow. And don't do anything just yet. I'd like you to keep your eyes closed or close them if you didn't have them closed, and also aim to find a position where you can straighten your spine a bit. We're going to do a small awareness, still paying attention to all the sensations awakened in your body, all the impressions from the taste, the texture. And aim now to become aware of the pleasure that this taste or these sensations are offering you. trying to direct your attention particularly to the sense of pleasure, this feeling of pleasure. And using the music as a background and a support aim, just to be present with that sensation of pleasure, relaxing into it and opening up towards it. Just stop it. And that is good. We will return gently. How was that experience? Does anyone feel to share how they felt this awareness of the experience of pleasure? The experience of pleasure is a particular energy that we can actually tune into. Someone is saying that the anticipation was really important. It is true, sometimes it works for us, sometimes against us, but for sure to be open to the experience and somehow to anticipate an openness in that direction does make a difference for how we can experience pleasure. But of course, also expecting or anticipating a very particular way of feeling it can also block us from what is really there. The experience of pleasure in itself, we can actually find this quite similar, regardless of what type of pleasure we are experiencing. Somehow where we end up after having a fulfilling, pleasurable experience, in fact, is more or less the same, regardless. That's a very interesting kind of effect, let's say, of intense pleasurable experiences. It's even a whole practice, and one of the important practices in Tantra, this possibility of ending up in a very expanded state as a result of a completely fulfilled experience. Because very often we are only partially fulfilled because we are only partially present. Someone also said that they noticed many more sensations in the parts of the body that they weren't aware of, which is also true. Once we start to pay attention, and that's one of the first things we can say Tantra is inviting us actually to do, is become aware of your body, increase your body awareness, and in this way become able to also increase your experience of pleasure. So first of all, bringing more awareness to the body and to the sensations coming to you through the body. And very often that's where the problem starts somehow for us and reaching fulfillment in our pleasurable experiences. We're kind of numb a little bit. And that means not just physically numb, because sometimes we're not even so sensitive physically speaking, because we're not used to paying attention to our body and to the sensations that we constantly receive through our body, simply because we're not really present. Our mind is somewhere else. And then we don't feel much. So often we're not really aware of what is going on, and therefore, of course, it doesn't bring us much pleasure. So first we have to, and that's where the anticipation indeed can be an advantage, we have to become present and attentive to be open to that pleasurable experience, or actually to life, instead of being somewhere else in our head. Now, the sensations somehow that we are having, the different sensorial impressions that we're having, which is the way that we experience pleasure and brings pleasure in our life. When we are not having those, we also deprive ourselves of a more rich emotional life, actually. Because the sensations that we are having are building blocks also for our emotions, our feelings. And in this way, you might even have discovered in this small exercise we just did, that just tasting something actually make you feel things. Even if it's just apparently purely a physical thing that you are doing, putting something in your mouth and tasting it, it can actually make you feel things. It can make you feel happy or feel relaxed, feel open, feel different nuances of sensations of pleasure. When we deprive ourselves from satisfying or attentively experienced pleasure, we also start to make our emotional life quite poor somehow. And the experience of pleasure and desire gives us appetite for life. I don't know if you noticed, in moments where, for instance, you have a very active erotic life, you tend to be more active in life, generally speaking, more interested in life and other people, feeling life much more delicious, much more present. You have more appetite for everything than just having, for instance, that pleasurable experience in your erotic life. Because somehow the experience of pleasure gives you appetite. This idea that appetite comes with eating. When you experience pleasure in a, you want more of life somehow, not just of that particular thing which is giving you pleasure. Now, of course, the very big power present in a pleasurable experience, the way it can somehow pull us or make us addicted, as we also see, becoming addicted to an experience of pleasure that might even be damaging for us, has given pleasure somehow a bit of a bad reputation, if you will. Even considered something that you should stay away from if you want to have a successful life, or particularly if you want to have a successful spiritual life, you should avoid pleasure, because that's going to just distract you and take you away from yourself and not make you focused somehow on what you are wanting to do. Same you see sometimes with people in their career. You cut out any kind of pleasurable experience so that you don't get distracted and you stay focused on what you have to do. From this perspective, that we don't feel we can control it, since when we are experiencing pleasure, it tends to be unconscious. And then it comes with a lot of negative consequences that seems to go against achieving what we then consider will bring us a higher state of happiness. Now, the problem, of course, being that without experiences of pleasure, life somehow ends up a little bit dull and meaningless. And it is one of the reasons why we can end up in depression and the feeling that there is no point in life and life somehow doesn't touch you. You're in a bubble, everything is gray and nothing stands out, and you feel disconnected. Not experiencing pleasure in a healthy and harmonious way will lead to a certain feeling of disconnection and somehow the sensation that life is dull or life is not alive, that we are not really connected to the juiciness of life anymore. Now, someone is asking me what natural pleasure is. There are many types of natural pleasure, because we can gain pleasure from a lot of different things, like eating something delicious, as we were just doing, can be a pleasurable experience. The experience of touch, we will very often consider something very pleasurable. And the maybe best and most natural and safest and so on modality for experiencing very intense states of pleasure that we have at hand would be erotic pleasure, or the pleasure that we experience in lovemaking and in intimacy with another human being. Actually, one of the reasons why that is a very important practice in Tantra, or considered one of the ways that we are practicing in order to expand our consciousness, as we are saying in Tantra, and reaching altered states of consciousness in a perfectly safe and healthy way with no side effects and so on. Indeed, in order for that to happen, we need to learn certain skills, both this awareness and relaxation as kind of a foundation attitude, the ability to be really present with the experience, and also obtaining a certain measure of control over the erotic energies, because we need to be able to expand into very intense states of pleasure without losing anything, if you know what I mean. So without losing the energy through ejaculation or in other ways, explosive reactions to that expansion. So if we really want to have a cosmic state of ecstasy, we need to have a good enough control to let that intensity of the pleasure grow to that. So there are some training needed in order to be able to have these expanded states. But the somehow best possibility indeed to practice this these very many beneficial effects of pleasure is in our erotic life. Now, pleasure somehow we can say is generated by this very mysterious ability of the human being to have a very intensely beneficial experience, resulting in a state of very deep relaxation. Because if you notice, when we have a very intense, pleasurable experience, we're extremely relaxed. If you're tense, if you're stressed, if you're agitated, you can't feel much pleasure. You can't enjoy things. You probably noticed if you're really stressed or tensed about something, even if you try to do things you actually normally enjoy, like sitting in the sun and reading a book or eating something nice, or even try to have time with your beloved, you just cannot really enjoy it because like you can't open towards that. You can't somehow surrender to that experience, and it doesn't give you any pleasure. Even a touch, actually, in that situation, if you're very stressed and agitated, you don't feel any pleasure. You might even feel a little bit like, oh, come on, don't touch me, go away, I don't like it. Even if in a state of deep relaxation and openness, it would bring you a lot of pleasure, and you would like very much that same touch maybe the night before. So for sure, this state of relaxation stays as a background for very intense and overwhelming experiences of pleasure. And in those moments, we somehow also let go of what otherwise stays there as a feeling of a necessity to protect ourselves against the environment, because often we have a lot of barriers up and we are a little bit ready to defend ourselves and protect ourselves in various ways. In the moment that we experience pleasure, it's like we let our guard down and we just relax and enjoy. We are not looking for a fight. We are not ready to defend. We actually go to the parasympathetic nervous system, or the part of our nervous system that says relax and enjoy. All is good, all is well. Really just go for it somehow. You're safe. So that would be another condition for us to consider if we want to have these very intense states of pleasure. We need to know how to relax and to feel somehow good and safe to expand and to open up to that experience, regardless of what it is that brings us pleasure. Now, pleasure is a tremendous force, and we all have a bit of different relationships with pleasure for that reason. As I said, it's also one of the reasons why often it has gotten a bit of a bad reputation in spiritual practices especially. But pleasure somehow this immense desire that is awakened with pleasure, have the ability to override even our survival instinct. It's that strong, somehow, the force or the power of an experience of pleasure and what it is awakening inside us. They made some experiments with rats, where they put some electrodes on the little animals, and then when they pushed a button, they would have kind of what would befell as an orgasm through this experience. So they would push a button and they would have easy access to an orgasmic experience, so an immense state of pleasure that would fill this little creature in that moment. And then they would put food and water just far enough away that the rat would have to move away from the button if he wanted to eat and drink, resulting in the poor animal more or less being close to dying from thirst and hunger because he did not want to stop pressing the button. It was so addictive somehow and so overwhelming, that desire for pleasure, that it would override any sense of survival. Normally, we would consider that the survival instinct somehow being the strongest pull in us, the strongest power in our being, but pleasure being even stronger. That would change very much our perspective also what pleasure means and what it can do. Of course, when unconsciously experienced, that could be really dangerous. You don't want to die of thirst and hunger or of negative consequences of overindulging into unhealthy substances, for instance. That is the danger with such a power, because even if it kills you, you cannot stop in those moments. When we bring awareness, it gains a different quality. It actually becomes a great advantage, because you can imagine somehow something that has such a deconditioning power is a formidable tool. especially when we are aiming to somehow decondition ourselves, let go of our limitations, and wanting to expand beyond our very limited sense of self. Very often somehow, and it can even happen actually in front of very intense experiences of pleasure, like orgasm. Sometimes that could be an obstacle even for experience orgasm, which maybe is one of the peaks of pleasure of human experiences. We can somehow have a fear, almost like a contraction inside, almost like a fear reaction, even if it's pleasure. And in a way, it doesn't make any sense. Why would you feel fear in front of something that brings you immense and overwhelming pleasure? Why would you contract? Why would you pull back? It is this sense of almost annihilation that we get when we get close to somehow surpassing the limits for our current perception of ourselves. Or in other words, go beyond the limits of our ego. Transcend somehow our limited perspective in this moment and gain a completely new perception of ourselves and the reality that we are part of. Tantra is said to be this expansion from finite to infinite, or an expansion of our consciousness, meaning somehow an expansion into life and into life experiences, having understandings, making connections, and gradually reaching a cosmic experience, by expanding even beyond, we can say, the limitations of a physical experience. Now, when we get to such a shift in perspective, you can imagine it shatters completely any kind of concept you have about yourself in this moment. Once you start to see yourself outside, we can say, any kind of limited belief you ever had about yourself and your existence, discovering that you are not limited to your physical body. You have a potentiality that goes vastly beyond anything you could ever have imagined. Confronted with such an experience, we can also feel fear and contraction because it's overwhelming, and can even feel a little bit like dying, because you die in reality to your old self and you are born to a new perception, a new experience, a new understanding of who you are and of your place in this universe. So there will be a death of something old and a birth of something new. And from the perspective of our limited sense of self, it is the end. And therefore, we could tend to respond with fear. That's often why it's difficult actually growing, for instance, on the spiritual path, because we get fearful in the moment we're about to break through to a new and higher understanding, because it seems like we will die somehow subconsciously, because we will die to the old version of ourselves. Now, bring in pleasure, your most formidable tool actually in that respect. Pleasure that has the power to overrule your survival instinct. Because somehow it's a bit like the survival instinct, what kicks in the moment that you're reaching beyond the limited beliefs you have had about yourself and your existence. You have this immense power of pleasure that lets you go beyond and let go of any fears and rather completely surrender into that experience of relaxed expansion. Because you can only expand when you're relaxed. When you're fearful, when you contract, you cannot expand, you cannot grow, you cannot go beyond those limitations. And therefore, pleasure, when used as a tool for this purpose, it is something that can bring us experiences way beyond our normal possibilities. For instance, again, in the lovemaking experience and in a moment of orgasm, this is exactly what happens and why it is so interesting from a tantric perspective. It allows us to expand that moment of intense and overwhelming pleasure beyond all our self-imposed limitations, and actually brings us to an experience of new somehow or transcendent perceptions of ourself and of reality. It's not by chance, by the way, for instance, the state of orgasm, as we know, is called the little death in French. From this understanding in reality, in the moment of such an overwhelming state of pleasure, you forget about yourself. You can somehow let go of the limited perception, what you're normally stuck in, of perspectives and ideas about yourself. It just all gets washed away in that overwhelming experience of pleasure, and it's gone, at least for a moment. Now, training to somehow go deeper into those states of pleasure and have longer and longer experiences of orgasm, we can expand far, far beyond those normal limitations, those normal perspectives that we're having. And in that moment, somehow we can have even an experience of the orgasm becoming a gate to higher states of consciousness. In that moment, passing somehow through a cosmic, or through this gate to a more cosmic perspective, or through to a much more, let's say, nuanced perspective of who we are and what this existence is about. Now, apart from this very amazing quality of pleasure, of being able to decondition us and somehow untie our limited perspectives and even our habitual reactions in front of things, it also has, on a somehow smaller scale, if you will, the ability to heal us profoundly. And even if we don't somehow at this moment maybe can relate to higher states of consciousness as a possibility through these very intensely, very consciously and well-controlled experiences of pleasure, even somehow the very beautiful and fulfilling experience in a lovemaking, even when in the moments where we don't manage to go all the way to a cosmic perspective or to transcendental states of consciousness, we can feel after with a lot of healing benefits. I don't know if you noticed. It's not actually only from erotic experiences that we can experience this healing power of pleasure, but it's often where it's the most obvious. When we live very deep and satisfying, pleasurable experiences, it makes us relax very profoundly. And even this very profound relaxation unties a lot of the tensions in our being, which otherwise are almost chronic. I'm not just talking about physical tensions. I'm also talking about emotional tensions and certain kind of ways in which we get stuck mentally. All of this is relaxed and undone, somehow untied, when we have repeatedly intense and deep experiences of pleasure. And in this way, we can heal a lot of problems, because what we discover also, if we know a little bit more about subtle anatomy, is that the tension we hold on other levels, emotionally and mentally and so on, can manifest as well as tensions and diseases in our physical body. So pleasure having this ability to really make us open up and relax and let go of all the tensions, very profoundly deconditioning somehow these perspectives that create tension and emotional tension and mental somehow stress in our being, will have also an immensely healing effect on our physical body. You can even just do a small Google search on the effect of pleasure, and you will be very surprised. It gives you a boost to the immune system. It makes your skin glow. It puts a smile on your face for sure. And we also know everybody can see somehow when you had a very wonderful night with your beloved, for instance. Everyone will be able to tell. They will even say somehow what happened last night, because you look so different, because you can see it somehow. There's natural glow that comes, this increased state of health and happiness and well-being. So even on that level, pleasure is extremely important. Conscious and harmoniously lived pleasure is very important for our sense of health and happiness and well-being in our everyday life existence. Also, pleasure is perhaps the best way of getting to know ourselves to begin with. When we experience pleasure, we connect very much to our physical body. as you noticed also in the exercise, this experience of pleasure, when we're very, very attentive to what happens, bring us very present on our physical body, and maybe even let us become aware of sensations that we did not notice were there before. So we start to discover our physical body and what happens in it, and its possibilities even to have more pleasure, and pleasure in different ways, and so on. And makes us enter what we can call the temple of the body. Now, when deepening an experience of pleasure, maybe you had a little bit of a taste of it in this awareness we did after you tasted something. When we deepen that experience of pleasure, you would even start to notice it has a dimension beyond what is physical. It starts to connect you also to other dimensions of the being, of your being. It's often said that pleasure is somehow the bridge between your mind and your body. Also because a lot of the pleasure happens in the brain. For instance, an orgasm or the orgasmic experience, a lot of the reactions are actually in the brain, much more than in the rest of your body. And somehow that's where the orgasm starts, with being in the right mindset, we can say. But we start to connect to other levels of our being when we really contemplate and go deep into the experience of pleasure, the emotional level, the mental level. And we can even, as said, go beyond to transcend somehow the experience of a limited sense of self, and even discover somehow the innermost parts of our being that is more like that of a universal self or a cosmic or godly existence within our being. So that's ultimately where the experience of pleasure could actually take us, to discover the very innermost and truest parts of ourselves. But starting somehow with an exploration of the senses and of our physical body. The condition, as said, always being that it happens in awareness. Because unconsciously experienced pleasure takes you further away from yourself rather than bringing you closer to yourself. We know very well the difference, because when we have this unconscious experience of pleasure, you often end up feeling a bit disconnected and unsettled somehow afterwards. Whereas very consciously lived pleasure makes you feel extremely close to yourself somehow. Very harmonious, very centered, very balanced, very happy. And I would dare say that consciously lived pleasure, especially through the erotic experience, is probably what the easiest gives us a very profound and overwhelming state of happiness that will also last for quite a while. So, pleasure in this way lived intensely and consciously, we can say, brings health and happiness and harmony, both physically, emotionally, and mentally, and would be one of the secret keys to a happy and balanced life. Also because this whole problematics around pleasure and the place to give it in your life. Making sure you have pleasure, because it's part of having a life that is alive and that is somehow connected and that is worth living, has meaning, has a sense of purpose even. We need to have a certain amount of pleasure, but how to find the right balance and the right position of that pleasure so that it doesn't take over and our life suddenly becomes meaningless because we overindulge in pleasurable experiences and we don't really fulfill a purpose in a bigger sense. Even in fulfilling a purpose, there is pleasure, actually. But we need to find a balance. And as I said, that one can be very hard to strike between somehow denying yourself the experience of pleasure or overindulging in pleasure. Both of them making you miserable. So you need to find that very delicate middle path of having a very pleasurable life that is in perfect balance. Consciously experiencing pleasure actually brings you to that spontaneously. Because when you are very, very aware in your pleasurable experiences, you will see all the consequences of that experience. And you will also see that a pleasure that brings you momentary happiness and fulfillment, but then makes you totally miserable afterwards because it was actually really bad for you, is not really bringing you pleasure in a bigger perspective. that we can only notice if we pay attention, if we're really present in our pleasurable experiences and what happens with that experience of pleasure following. Now, when we manage to find this way of experiencing pleasure on the background of a state of awareness and relaxation, we will strike that balance. We will find a harmonious balance and the harmonious kind of proportion of pleasure in our life. And then we can also discover something quite miraculous, that we don't have to categorize it like that at all. Usually we have somehow the things that we think are pleasurable and the things that we don't think are pleasurable, and then we consider balances between kind of making that sort of even, and then we will have a state of balance which then should bring us happiness. It doesn't really, because the balance means something else in reality. What we will see when we start to re-educate the way that we relate to pleasure, when we start to have this attitude of awareness and relaxation and being really present with the impression that comes to us through the senses, taking pleasure becomes much more nuanced somehow. What you can take pleasure in becomes much more nuanced. You can take pleasure in the wind touching your face, for instance, and blowing in your hair a little. You can take pleasure in a beautiful smell of a flower. You can take pleasure in the sight of a beautiful man or woman passing you on your way to work. You can take pleasure in a lot of impressions that come to you, also when you are not seeking pleasure as such. And also you will notice that there is a certain experience of pleasure in meditating, for instance. Meditating can be an intensely pleasurable experience. It's a different kind of pleasure, though. It's somehow a deeper pleasure. It brings pleasure to the deeper parts of your being. It makes your heart happy, for instance. There is a certain pleasure in that as well. There is a certain pleasure in offering love or being generous. That is actually an experience of somehow pleasure in that. Indeed, a different kind of nuance than the one we feel if we eat ice cream or we make love, but still, it's very, very pleasurable. And we can start to notice that most things we are engaging, in fact, can be pleasurable if we are present in them in this open and aware and relaxed way. Because life, generally speaking, is a very pleasurable experience. True, not always, but actually most of the time, if we are open to perceive that. And if we open up to this a bit more nuanced perception of what pleasure actually means. And this will allow us also to have somehow fulfilled pleasurable experience, or the feeling of somehow being fulfilled, having enough pleasure in life without having to overindulge and then feeling guilty because we feel we are not doing what we are supposed to or fulfilling our duties, which also actually gives us a certain sense of pleasure when we feel we achieve something, for instance. That balance we find very naturally when we have the right attitude in front of the pleasurable experience. Now, if you have any questions or comments thus far, feel free to either write in the chat or even better to unmute yourself and ask directly. Now, it might be worth somehow mentioning here that this idea of making pleasure a path or giving it somehow a very important place in your life does not mean that you are avoiding anything that you might find unpleasant or that you will be able to avoid suffering, because suffering is a part of our existence as well, same as pleasure is. However, suffering make us tense and make us contract often in front of life, having not somehow the same opening effects as pleasure. But still there is a certain quality also validating the presence of suffering in our life, because we can learn in two different ways, either from pleasure or from suffering. Both are teaching us something. When we experience a lot of pleasure, we can also take it as a feedback that we're doing something right. We're kind of on the right track, we can say. But when we experience suffering, it's also a sign for us. Something there is a little bit out of order. You have maybe not the right perspective on this situation. You are not having the right proportions in your life in this moment. There is something there that begs your attention. So it's not to somehow avoid or refuse or suppress suffering in this way. Take it as a feedback. But in the same time, don't deny yourself pleasure, because it is one of the kind of paradoxical situations that we see in our modern life. We have a very strange relationship with pleasure, actually. As I said, because on one hand, we tend to be super focused on getting something that can bring us pleasure, whatever it is. And we tend to have little addictions all around, with little guilty pleasures, even, as we call them. And then on the other hand, we deny ourselves doing that, or we feel guilty after we do it because we somehow feel it's wrong. And this very somehow disharmonious relationship with pleasure is a shame, because it's blocking us from the beneficial and actually immense power present in the experience of pleasure for our transformation. So that's why we focus on this idea of healing, we can say, our relationship with pleasure, and realizing what a treasure we have there, where probably the best way of learning is through Tantric eroticism. Understanding somehow the different way of relating to your erotic life, as we do in a Tantric practice, is the best way of understanding the role of pleasure and getting a harmonious relationship, we can say, with pleasure, and using it as a very, very powerful tool for our transformation. And that's also why, for instance, on the weekend, I have a whole workshop about orgasm, being the peak somehow of our pleasurable experience, and therefore also a gate for us to pass through to transcendental states of consciousness and experiences that go beyond our normal everyday life possibilities. So if there are no questions, I just want to mention that we are a charity, and donations, however big or small, are always very warmly welcomed. None are too small or too big, for that matter. So if you feel like, we will be very grateful. Otherwise, we hope you enjoyed and it was useful for you, this perspective. If you really somehow intuited the power behind it, you will realize that the shift in perspective on pleasure is something that can transform your life radically. All you need to do is practice, because you have all tools at hand. You need your body first and foremost, and then a bit of training of awareness and presence. And then ecstasy is not so difficult, with a little bit of training, coming with many more benefits than you can anticipate.
I have a question, if it's still okay.
Please.
So at the moment, I don't have a lover, and I'm wondering, of course, one solution is go and find one, but while being single, how far can one go in terms of the exploring and the erotic pleasure and the training oneself to be able to have longer experiences and so on? Is it essential to have a partner?
Yes, I mean, from a tantric perspective, in order to really have these profound experiences of orgasm, you do need someone else there, because it is actually entering in a unity with that person on the background of an overwhelming love that allows that to happen. That's not to say that you can't do anything because you don't have somebody at the moment, because you could train, at least we can say, the attitudes necessary to have that experience much more easily when you also have someone present, like this idea of awareness and relaxation. Also meditation, concentration exercises. It sounds boring and like it has not much to do with juicy lovemaking, but it is in fact a condition, we can say, for higher experiences as well. Studying about it as well, understanding more the mechanisms related to eroticism and how it is approached quite radically differently, I would say, in a tantric practice, also is a good preparation. So somehow mostly you can prepare, and then when you also meet somebody, you can put it in practice. Otherwise, somehow practices of self-pleasuring and so on, it doesn't really bring you beyond the ego limits so easily, because it tends to amplify them rather, because it's you with yourself. It's not you merging with someone or something else in this way. And therefore, it's not really having the same properties, unfortunately, to be able to do this. And also, from any man who ever tried practicing controlling energies by himself, he knows that once a woman is in the room, is a completely different story, and his apparent control goes out the window, because suddenly things are surprising and spontaneous. And when you do it yourself, you kind of know what to expect. So it's a very different scenario in that case.
Got it. Thank you very much. And thank you for the whole lecture. It's been very good.
Thank you. There is a raised hand. The raised hand is very free to unmute and ask.
Sorry, that was accidental. Thank you. It was really great. Thank you for the talk.
Good. Last chance.
Thank you, Maria.
Okay, in that case, thank you everyone, and have a great and pleasurable night and week ahead. And I'll see you another time. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
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 Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Maria. Good night.
Night, night.